Hey folks, so I wanted to make a video here to kind of just review some of the top teams that we have in North America right now, and this will consist of speaking a little bit about the roster changes that took place with some of the top teams in the NA scene, as well as how some of their debuts have gone, and just what we've seen them do in, I guess, maybe their first month or two together as a team for each of the top teams in the region. Now, originally I was going to do this as an article, which is why this may be coming out a little bit later than it probably should have. But it just allowed me to kind of even add in some of the major qualifier stuff as well, so it's not all bad. But my man Risk, Niels from Denmark, already released an article kind of talking a little bit about who won the roster change scenario, basically. And I'll kind of address that in this video a bit, but because he wrote that article, which is kind of similar to what I wanted to do, I decided to just turn it into a vlog. And so that's what I'm going to do now, as I'll just kind of address each top team in the region, just talk a little bit about what we've seen out of them thus far with their new lineups. So I'm going to start off with CLG, as of course their big roster change was losing Finesse, who joins TSM, as well as they bring in Fugly to replace him. And basically what we've seen CLG do with their new lineup is we have JDM, who's still, of course, the opper and probably one of the best oppers in the region, if not the best opper in the region. Though I guess if you start mixing in like Brazilian teams and stuff like that into the mix, then maybe not. But certainly the best true North American player that's an opper in that specific role. Might be a little bit weaker on the rifles, but obviously a good op. Then you have Cutler, who I think is a very stable player, just a very consistent fragger, usually going to be second, third on the board almost all the time. He's going to contribute very well. And he's kind of playing a hard lurk role now. He used to be more of a supportive player, maybe even somewhat mixed in on executes, but now he seems to be, playing a lot of lurking positions, like playing outside B on overpass or playing outside B on cash. Or playing outside long A on Dust 2. These different, peripheral positions seems to be his new home on the team. And with that, he was in-game leading a little bit there at the end for CLG. He and Finesse are kind of swapping out, but now they have PETA, who as the coach is actually leading the team now and calling the tactics as part of this new evolution of how in-game calling is working for some teams. PETA is certainly at the forefront of that in the NA scene, calling from that role. Now, on top of that, Hayes still playing an entry fragger role as well, creating space, being the first guy in on most executes. And the last two players are Tarek, of course, and Fugly, the newcomer. And these guys kind of fluctuate in their roles. On certain maps, you see Tarek being the peripheral role player, such as maybe Dust 2, he's kind of playing B tunnels a bit, or Cash, he might be playing Squeaky Door. On Overpass, he might be playing Stairs. But in some cases, you do see Fugly taking on peripheral roles as well. But both of them kind of swap between playing edges of the map or being kind of a secondary entry fragger behind Hayes. It seems like Fugly has taken this more than Tarek has, but occasionally you also see Tarek involved as a secondary or third man in at different times. So I think, those two kind of fluctuate, but everyone else seems pretty firmly rooted. And basically, since they put that formula together, what we've really noticed CLG do is just play a much slower, more methodical style of play, something that they certainly didn't do that much. I mean, yeah, they always had a default, but it almost seemed like they were just more execute heavy, more aggressive, and they have stuck to their aggressive roots in some cases. They still do have those powerful executes, but it's after they've established a firm base, after running a default and having these slower, more methodical rounds at the beginning of the half, and then once they have that established, then they start mixing in these heavy executes. It's not at the forefront of their strategy as it used to be, though they still have the aggression on CT sides mixed in quite a lot, which certainly goes back to classic CLG basically. And so just kind of wanted to mention that briefly about just their changes to the team as far as roster and their style of play. Now, basically, this team has played two LANs together now. The first LAN being their debut, which was at GEC, the game show tournament. And they opened up that tournament by playing against Envious, where they lost the series, but they did take a map. They won Overpass. And then they went on to lose Train pretty heavily, but they played very competitively on Cash in this series as well. So this was a really good series for CLG. It was their first best of 3 as of 5, and they were going up against, maybe the number 2 team in the world over here in Envious. and they take a map off of them. Granted, it was Overpass, not a very strong Envy map, but still, a talented team that they were able to take a map off of. And like I said, they look pretty competitive there on map 3 on Cash, only losing 13-16, so a pretty good game. They then go on to 2-0 Flipside Tactics on Inferno and Overpass, which Inferno historically a pretty weak map for CLG. Still kind of is, but they managed to get that over Flipside and then just crush them on Overpass. Then they replay Envy again. Again, they are going to get 1-2'd. Again, they win Overpass, but they get absolutely just destroyed on Cash and Cobble this time around. Wasn't even competitive. So this certainly wasn't as good as their initial series against Envy, though they still did get a map. And then the biggest thing that comes from this tournament is going to be their game against Gamers 2, of course, the former Titan over there. And here they win their first best-of-3 series on LAN against, a somewhat top European opponent. I'm not really sure where you'd rank G2 these days. They might be towards the bottom of the top 10 or just outside of it, but certainly still a pretty good team. And this is CLG's first time ever doing this type of thing on LAN, getting this type of victory, so that was certainly well done. They went on Dust 2. They do lose Inferno, but they come back and win Cobble, which is another map that they've, toyed around with and been generally pretty good on. We've seen them, have some close games with Na'Vi in the past, including even a victory on the map. And we've just seen them play that pretty well in the NA scene as well. And they get the win here against Gamers 2 on it, so well done. Now, from this point forward, things get a little bit tougher on CLG. They go on to play Dignitas to try to make it to the finals. This is a semifinals matchup. And they lose. This time they actually drop Overpass, which had looked so powerful against Envy twice, as well as against Flipside Tactics. But it just doesn't pan out this time around. They get beat. And they also get beat on Cobble 14-16. Very close game. And of course, Dignitas has proven to be quite an expert on Cobble, and they've really risen up along the way. So Dignitas' story of rising up, which prior to this, they had DreamHack Leipzig, where they also did pretty good. This is kind of like CLG's debut story alongside this rise of Dignitas, at least at this particular moment in time. And they wound up losing that best-of-3. Though they were competitive in it. But then they just get absolutely ripped apart by Astralis in the third place decider match, losing on Overpass really big again, and then losing Dust 2 really big again. So basically at the tournament, they played Overpass 5 times. They went 3-2 on it. So pretty good showing there on Overpass. They looked competitive once on Cash. The only time they played it was the loss is against Envy, both times. So they lose both those games, so they look competitive 1 out of the 2. Cobble, they played that, I guess, 3 times. Won it once, lost it twice. Once pretty competitive against Dignitas, once a pretty much landslide loss to Envy. And then we saw them play Inferno a couple times, which isn't really a good map for them. And we saw them play D2 a couple times where they traded it 1-for-1. So map pool still seems to not be so firmly grounded. It seems like they can rely on Overpass a good bit, but they also dropped it a couple times. And they look like they still have their sense about them on Cobble and Cash. But overall, I thought it was a decent debut. They placed top 4. Like I said, they got their first big best-of-3 win against Gamers 2, and they look competitive against Envy in a couple of series, at least on certain maps. And so this wasn't a bad debut, I don't think, for their first time with the 5 being together with a new caller. They certainly looked very tactically sound. It was really coming down to individual performances, I think, that killed them for the most part. I think they usually had the right game plan, the right minds about them. I think from watching this debut, as well as watching, at the major qualifier and stuff, they seem to be the best NA team when it comes to tactics and strategy. So I think that's certainly a good thing to have. They can just build upon that with, consistent individual performances. As, at this GEC event, no one went positive as far as KD ratio goes, which can be somewhat concerning, but you do have to take it with a grain of salt, as they did have 6 pretty lopsided map losses throughout the tournament. So that really killed their numbers. If you take those lopsided losses out and just look at their close losses or their wins, JDAM certainly did go positive at this event and looked to be the star opera he has been for them for some time. And some of the other guys, like Cutler, for instance, would have probably been closer to being positive as well, though some of the other guys probably still would have been negative even without the 6 lopsided losses. So certainly, especially Tarek, who actually was the worst performer, who's supposed to be kind of the star player, so that was a little bit concerning from GEC. But otherwise, besides the individual performances thing, they at least looked like a well-run team, and they were competitive. Now, once they got back from this event, their ride in NA was certainly quite rough, as they are 1-5 right now in the EEPL Season 3. This includes just getting wrecked in best of ones by Enemy Renegades and Cloud9. It just didn't even look competitive in these games. Then they went on to play in the IEM Katowice qualifier, where they just got beat by Tempo Storm 0-2, including, a big loss on Inferno. And they were somewhat competitive on Cobble, but still got blasted. And then in the Malmo qualifiers, they got straight destroyed by Liquid, only getting 5 rounds total across 2 maps. But they did manage to beat Cloud9 2-0 in the series, and so they did get that 3rd spot to go actually play at Malmo. So while they had certainly some rough maps in some of these online tournaments, they did at least get a berth into LAN for Malmo to give themselves another shot at a big tournament. So that was good in the end, despite the fact that along the way it certainly looked a bit shaky. And then obviously most recently they just qualified for the major, after getting upset by Splice in a best of 1 to kick off the groups. They managed to, I guess, upset SK. I mean, you might take that as an upset or not. And again, it was Overpass. CLG continues to prove that's a map that they can use. And then they went on to play Vex in the best of 3 decider, where they won a close game on Dust 2, got crushed on Cobble, and then wound up winning a close game on Train, which is a map that they haven't played so much with their current 5, so that was a really big win to get, though Vex, of course, was using a stand-in, and they had their own situation to deal with. But they got the job done. They qualified for the major, and that's what really matters most, right? And at this event, we saw some better individual performances to match up with, the better strategy that they've been building up. Cutler in the event very well. Tarek had one of the better lands I've seen him have in quite a long time, which was certainly good to see. Hayes struggled a little bit, but he got his job done, especially against Vexed in the decider best of 3. I would say JDM also didn't really look himself this event, but he came up when it mattered most in that last Train match against Vex to actually get the land spot, so good there. Fugly also had some issues. We looked pretty good against SK, which helped them get into the decider. And so each player kind of had their moments. Yes, overall, some of the players really certainly struggled, but Tarek, it was good to see him come back alive and play well. Good to see Cutler doing well, and good to see JDM come alive when he was needed on that Train game to solidify their qualification. So I would say pros and cons wise for CLG going forward now. Pros is they look good under PETA. Like I said, they look like they're on the same page. They look pretty disciplined. They have a good play style. They have that firm, established default methodical style. They've mixed in their executes. They have good CT sides that are stable. They're able to mix in aggression there as well. So I think they're a pretty well-rounded team as far as their playbook goes, and that's certainly a positive for them. They still have a very strong star player in JDM with the AWP, even though he struggled a little bit here at the major qualifier. In general, he's looked good for quite some time for this team, so that's also a big positive for them. I think now that the weight's been lifted off of Cutler's shoulders, and he's learning his new role as playing like a hardcore lurk, he seems to be starting to put up numbers again and look really stable, and so that's another big positive for this team. I think the big question marks for this team is how's Fugly going to fit in, because he certainly was in a big slump at the end of the year with Liquid, and the 2 events he's played so far at CLG, he still hasn't looked like he quite hasn't got back up to form, and again, his role kind of fluctuates a bit compared to some of the others. So that's going to be a question mark. How is Fugly going to mix in here, and is he going to be able to get back to what we saw when he was like the rock player for Liquid way back in early 2015? The other question is, Tarek looked good at the major qualifiers, but he also had a rough end to the year of 2015. And he also had a rough time at GEC. So we need to see if Tarek can do it in some big international lands, at Malmo, at the major. We need to see Tarek play just as well as he did at the major qualifiers for this team to have enough firepower to get through some of the elite level teams. Outside of that, I think Hayes does his job. I mean, yeah, he's not putting up big numbers, but he's doing his role, and he can have an occasional good game here and there. When he has a really good game, that really can help out his team for certain. Remember that upset against Fnatic on Mirage a while back, right? So yeah, I mean, I think they have a lot going for them. It's just a couple of players need to kind of find their form when they're needed most in some big games against elite teams. And their map pool might be somewhat concerning as well, because I think that they have Overpass as a pretty good map, though we did see him lose it a couple times at GEC as well. I think they're comfortable on Cash and Cobble, but we still see them being a bit shaky against some top teams on those maps. Their Inferno is still certainly a problem. Still don't really play that, which I guess isn't too big of a deal. You do get, at least one ban in a best of three. But they also, what I heard in an interview from Hayes was that they were kind of a little bit concerned with Mirage, even though it used to be a map they could rely on quite a lot. So they need to kind of bring Mirage back under the fold, solidify their cache and cobble, keep their overpass good. But then again, even if they get those maps going for them, you still have to worry about Inferno and Train. Which one of those two are you gonna want to ban? You're not going to be able to always ban both of them, obviously, or you might get a matchup or one of those maps gets through. So maybe kind of working on their map pool a little bit is also something that you need to think about with this team as well. And I'll kind of just leave it as that for an initial review of CLG. Now, Cloud9 is the next team we'll talk about. Of course, their big thing was losing Sean Gares to bring in Stewie2K. And, of course, this has hurt the team a lot when it comes to leadership and when it comes to their actual strategy, though Stewie has proven at times to be good when it comes to firepower. But we'll talk about that just in a little bit. So first I want to start off with the fact that they were also at GEC along with CLG. And at this event, they played G2 first in a best of three, where they won an overtime game on Cash and played a close game against G2 on Train, but ultimately lost, and then kind of got destroyed on Cobble. So iffy best of three here. At least they got a map, but really struggled on that Cobble game, which used to be a map Cloud9 was pretty solid on. And then we saw them get the 2 against Method, but kind of hard to draw any conclusions from this since Method was using 2 stand-ins for this event, and they weren't always known as a big team anyway. But, took care of business, got the 2 there. They wound up playing G2 again. This time they got absolutely destroyed on Cash and then lost on Train again in a close game. And then they went on to play Envy, where they looked competitive. They played on Mirage and Overpass, which Mirage was always a map Cloud9 was usually always avoiding, alongside Inferno. So to see them, play pretty decent against Envy on Mirage, that was good. And then Overpass, it was another pretty close game, but ultimately they lose. Now, coming back from that, we do see them play in the Katowice qualifier, where they wind up getting knocked out by Tempo Storm again after beating Optic earlier in the tournament. We're pretty competitive against Tempo Storm, but this match, along with some matches we saw at GEC, brings up a constant theme that we've seen in Cloud9 lately, which certainly has to be a result of their loss of leadership in Sean Gares, which is the fact that they had an opportunity to beat Tempo Storm and get the slot for NA for Katowice. But the biggest problem is their T-sides just were non-existent. So to give you an example here against Tempo Storm, on Mirage, they lost the game 14-16. This was because they actually had 11 rounds on the CT side in the first half of Mirage, but lost the second half 3-12, as they couldn't get any more than 3 rounds on the T side to close the game. And so that's why you see them lose this. Then on Cash, they lose in overtime. And once again, they had 10 rounds on the CT side in the first half on Cash, but they couldn't get that 6 rounds they needed to close the game in regulation. They wound up going into overtime and losing. And so Tempo Storm gets the qualification slot for Katowice, and Cloud9, move on with nothing. Then we see them in the DreamHack Malmo qualifier, where they 2-1 Energy. After losing Inferno, they come back pretty convincing on Train, and they win Dust 2. Then we see them play against Tempo Storm. They do lose this series once again, losing on Inferno, losing on Dust 2, even though they had a Train win there. And then we see against CLG in the best of 3, they lose Cash in a close game, but again, they had a good first half lead on CT, but just couldn't find anything on the Terra side. Only found 3 rounds on the T side on the Cash game. And then on Cobble, they just got crushed 3-16. And so they miss out on both of these tournaments, where with Katowice, Tempo Storm get it, and then for Malmo, it's Liquid, Tempo Storm, and CLG that get the slots for that tournament. So they miss out on a couple of lands, mostly due to the fact that they just couldn't get their T sides in order. They had some pretty good CT sides. They had decent individual performances at times, but again, they just struggled strategically against CLG, who, like I said, seems to be kind of the best tactical team in NA right now. And then, obviously having trouble with the Brazilians in both those tournaments. Now, at the major, they do manage to qualify, but again, it was a little bit scary because of these T-sides. So they played Gambit on Cash, where they lose, and that's because they were only able to find 3 rounds on the T-side in the first half of this game. Now, they move on to play Dignitas on Cash in the elimination match, And they do win the game 16-13, but they really struggled to close this game. They, once again, had 11 CT rounds in the first half. They just needed 5 to close the game, and it took them quite a while to get there. It was looking like they might get eliminated there for a moment as Dignitas was making this comeback on their own CT side, and there was certainly some concern, but they do pull through, where they do go on to play against Renegades, where these are some nail-biter matches. They just win Mirage 16-14. And then they, play Cash and win that 19-16 again, having some good CT sides, but really struggling to close on these terrorist sides. From the major qualifiers, it is important to point out that Shroud looked really good, put up some great numbers, so you got to give him some props there. Finally, really rising up to the occasion. I thought Skadoo looked fine for the most part. Nothing also ended the event pretty well. I would say Stewie had a couple of good maps against Renegades and Dignitas, and you want him ending the event positive, actually, despite there being some moments where he wasn't playing so well. So that was a good showing from him, especially compared to GEC, where he seemed to struggle a bit. And so that talks a little bit about the individual performances from those guys. As, of course, Freakazoid has never really been the guy to put up big numbers throughout an entire tournament for his team. He'll have his map, maybe an occasional series where he looks good, but he mostly just kind of plays his entry fragger role and is known for being kind of a somewhat of a leader on the team, as well as just being that entry fragger to try to create space and things of that nature. So an overall review of Cloud9 throughout this entire process is there's obviously some pros and cons to look at. Cons-wise, which they've admitted themselves, Nothing has done this on Twitter in his stream, and even in different interviews, we see players talking about, we need some help, we need to get a coach, we need to get somebody to help us out. Obviously, their T-sides have been an issue. Obviously, leadership in general has been an issue. This isn't just leadership as far as creating tactics and strategy, but it's also about molding a new player in Stewie 2K to really help him succeed. Because I know that he's had some games that look bad, like at GEC. Even a couple of maps here at the major qualifier, he'd look, rough, even though he had also some great games against Renegades and Dignitas. So who's going to be able to mold him and teach him the things he needs to be a more developed player? So these are some huge concerns for this team because their T-sides have been just an absolute train wreck in many cases, and so they really need some help in that regard. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. That's actually kind of their biggest problem, is just being able to actually have a leader to help them with strats and how to approach the terror side of many of their maps, and to just kind of coach the players through. Apparently Ryu helped them out at the LAN at the major qualifier before they played against Renegades in the decider game. So Ryu could actually be someone who could help this team as a coach. I'm not sure whether he would leave his group of players over there at Selfless to come coach Cloud9 full-time, or if they could just use him for now, to help with the major, because obviously Selfless isn't going to the major. They didn't qualify. So maybe at the very least, Ryu could help this team for the next, month or two to get them help prepared for the major. That's something to think about. Because to be honest, their other best option is going to be a Dren, who is obviously going to be playing with Liquid at the major. So he's not going to be available to help them right now. And I say that because apparently they've already tried to get Pronax and that didn't work. It also didn't work out getting Gabi, who now, plays for Energy. Pronax, I already think I mentioned Pronax. All right, I mentioned Pronax, I mentioned Gabi. So in reality, who else are you going to get that is available that's like kind of a free agent that you might be able to pick off from someone? It doesn't seem like there really is that many people available. Like, unless you can hire like a Yanko or a Vendetta or a Moses, maybe some of these guys, and not to, I'm not sure who else they could even approach that would possibly be interested. So it seems like a Dren would be probably the best candidate. He's already in NA. He likes those guys. He gets along with them. He's expressed interest in possibly coaching. So it seems like this would be a perfect matchup, but unfortunately it has to wait until after the major, since Dren's still providing services to Liquid as a player. So maybe Ryu for now, see how that goes. If it works, keep him. Or at the very least, if Ryu wants to stay with his team, then maybe bring in a Dren after the major. So that's one possible solution. We'll just have to see how that works out, because that is pivotal to this team being successful, is figuring out this whole coaching situation and leading situation. One other thing I will say is Shroud's role seems to have reverted back to his more passive peripheral role, because it's like Nothing and Shroud playing the edges of the map. I mean, I would say Nothing's kind of more of the harder lurk, while, you know, Shroud is more of like a peripheral role player, but more involved in the attack. So using Kashyyyk as an illustration, Nothing is going to be your B lurk. And on these heavy A executes, Shroud will be at door and he'll help with the heavy A hit or help with mid control. Obviously, if it's a B hit, then Shroud's kind of the one holding rotate today or middle or what have you. So it just depends on where you go. But he's become more of a peripheral role player again, which is something they were trying to get him away from. At least underneath Sean Gare's leadership, because I remember when he first joined Cloud9, he did play that same peripheral role, but along the way, Sean Gare's eventually noticed that Shroud's aim and just what he saw him do on stream and, you know, playing in 10-mans and different things like that, he saw that, hey, if I can send Freakazoid in here and create some space, I get Shroud out there with his sick aim and information, he can really help us execute a site. And so he got shifted in more of secondary and true role fragger. You know, you saw this map pool wide helping with executes a lot more, because it was more of Nothing in Sean Gare's playing the edges of the map. And so now, and I thought Shroud was performing in that role, and that's where you can really tap his max potential, I feel like. But with Stewie coming onto the team now, he's also a very aggressive guy, and obviously Freak's your entry fragger too. So now it's been Stewie and Freak kind of being this 1-2 punch, and Shroud's gone back to a more peripheral role, as I noted. So I don't know if you're really yielding the maximum of Shroud's potential if you're putting him back in that role. He seemed to play fine and put up good numbers at the major qualifier, so maybe it doesn't matter, but that might be something to think about in the future. Though it would be hard to swap something out. You'd have to move someone else to a perimeter role, and that would only be possible for, say, Freak or Stewie. I'm not sure if that would be, you know, better options on the edge, so it might just be out of necessity Shroud does play that role, but we'll just have to see. Obviously, some positives are they have a good amount of skill. They do have some firepower, especially Shroud and Skadoodle. Nothing still seems to put up decent numbers. Stewie, I think, with time could put up numbers, but he needs to be coached and molded and groomed to be a better player, to have some better game sense, to have some better understanding of not just this whole stereotype of how he pushes smokes and stuff, you know. So I think he has the aim. It's just about figuring out how to harness that. So they do have some skill, and their CT sides seem to be pretty good. You know, I've seen them put up pretty big numbers on CT sides against several good teams. So they have that going for them. So we'll just have to see. It seems like they've gotten better on Train. I guess Train was always a map they were okay on. They seem to be approaching Mirage now, so they seem to be trying to expand their map pool, but I don't know if maybe they've lost some of their edge on some of the maps they used to be quite strong on, like a Cobble, for instance, or like an Overpass, which they had pretty good at one point. So we have to think about the map pool as well, maybe going forward also. So the last team I'm going to talk about is Liquid. Now, I know there's other top NA teams to talk about, depending on how big of a top list you want to make, which would maybe include teams like TSM, Complexity, you know, Optic, Energy, you know, even Splyce now, because they qualified for the major, is probably in contention. I will say I'm going to be probably writing an article about Splyce and their kind of Cinderella story of making the major, so I didn't include them in this video. Optic hasn't changed their roster in quite a while, and I've already talked about them in the past, I think, so I didn't include them in this video as well. And then for TSM and Energy and Complexity, they just haven't played enough for me to really make any kind of assessment. And I think TSM's only played like 2 best-of-3s total. You know, once in, I think, the Malmo qualifiers, and then once in the LCQ for the major, where they lost to Winterfox, and they lost to Renegades in Malmo qualifier. Other than that, I haven't really seen them play any official matches. Energy, kind of in the same boat, saw them play a little bit in the Malmo qualifier, and a couple of EEPL matches, but that's really about it. And then Complexity, same boat, a couple of EEPL matches, like 1 CEVO best-of-3, so there's just not much there yet to really assess them. So I'm just going to end the video on Liquid and know that an article about Splyce is coming out, and I may address some of these other teams that I am not addressing here in another video at some point in the future. So with Liquid, it's kind of a tale of 2 teams, to be honest, which makes it really hard to talk about results, because obviously when it comes to the major qualifier, where they qualified by, you know, losing the HR in a best-of-1 in double overtime, then crushing YP, and then beating Hellraisers in this crazy, you know, comeback on Dust 2 and Mat 3 of the series to qualify for the major, that's all done with Adren, who isn't even a part of their starting 5 anymore, right? And obviously Kusta has come in for Adren, and obviously Simple was a recent addition, and you still have, you know, Hiko, Nitro, and Elige. So it's kind of hard to really think about how you want to approach this, since the whole major story is with Adren, and then everything else now is with Kusta. But with Kusta, they haven't played so much. And it's also worth noting, I already did a video addressing Liquid a bit, when I did a roster change video about Kusta, so I'll put that in the description below. Also made a video about Fugly joining CLG and so I think I might have done something about Cloud9 as well, maybe not. But I know I did make a video about Fugly joining CLG, which talked about CLG a little bit there. So I'll include those couple of videos in the description below so you can learn more about those teams and what I've said prior if you would like to. But with Kusta, so far we've seen them play the DreamHack Malmo qualifiers, where they did qualify because they swept that tournament pretty heavily. You know, I guess the two notable teams they played against was Renegades, where they won that series on Dust 2 and Mirage. And then on CLG, they won on Mirage and Dust 2 as well. So looking pretty good on Mirage and Dust 2. It seems to be, you know, some of the maps they've been using a lot. Then they played in a couple of best of ones against Energy in EEPL, where they lost on Dust 2 close, but then they won Cabo pretty handedly. So not much play with Kusta thus far. So most of the things that would say about them, really, I've already kind of said in the Kusta video, like I said, that I'll link below. But here's a couple of things to think about with Liquid going forward, since we haven't seen them play so much with Kusta just yet, so I can't really talk too much about results. One thing to think about on this team, similarly to Cloud9, is what about leadership on this team? Yes, they have a coach in James who can help them, you know, keep them in line or offer suggestions or help them scout opponents. And I think they had an analyst that helped them scout as well, but I'm not sure if they still have one. But as far as actually who will lead the team, who will call the shots, who will call the tactics, and they seem to be bouncing this around a lot from interviews I've seen, where it was Nitro initially in practice and in the major, but then apparently Nitro kind of looked to Adren for help with calling in different instances, and I think Adren maybe called a lot during some of the maps, and then apparently Elige even pitched in some calls, and so it's almost like a community leadership at this point on Liquid, but I think they really need kind of a firm leader to help them out. And I really don't want it to be Nitro because I feel like he's been crippled by leading. When you look at some of these games like at Malmo qualifiers and EEPL and even at the major qualifier, his numbers weren't nearly as good as they were at the end of 2015, where he was really showing us to be like the best player in an A. And I think that you don't cripple Nitro. He's the best entry fragger in North America, hands down. Granted, I know sometimes Elige takes priority on entry over him, but on a lot of maps, especially like Cash, Cobble, you know, these different maps, he does lead the executes, and he's a very powerful entry fragger. He's got great aim. He's a good fragger. And I feel like if he's going to struggle to lead, and then on top of that he has to try to keep up his individual form where he's so powerful, I just think that's probably not the right approach. So what could be the right approach? Well, Hiko's led before with Elevate at a like CEVO Season 6 lane, like way in early 2015, and he's expressed interest in doing it. He seemed to even like it. And he plays a role in the game as a fragger, like a more passive rifler that would maybe be a little bit more conducive to leading, so maybe that's an option. I know Elige was mentioned as maybe leading. He seems to be a pretty smart guy, but I guess he felt like he wasn't experienced enough to do it yet. And he's also kind of playing an entry fragger role, and his own individual performance has been a little bit inconsistent as far as fragging goes, so I don't know if that would hurt him even more to be leading. You know, you don't want to hurt the fragging power you have by putting leadership on them, I guess, if it's going to affect them too much. So I think there's a big question mark out there. There's the obvious option of adding in a coach alongside their coach or something, like, you know, maybe having James be more of like an assistant coach and then have like a main coach that actually leads the team. That's an option. Obviously, Adren would be a good candidate for this, as well as he's like a good candidate for Cloud9 situation. But would that be too awkward, I guess would be the question there. At first, I would say, yeah, I think it's a little bit awkward to like cut the guy from your starting lineup and try to bring him back as a coach. But he did play with them in the major qualifier, and they seem to get along pretty well. So maybe it is an option just to keep Adren along and have him lead from outside the game. Maybe he'll even be more effective at it from that. And he already has really good ideas about Nitro Elige. He's played alongside them for quite a long time. You know, he knows Hiko well also. I just think maybe the relationship with him and Simple might be a bit rough. I know that they've had some disagreements, but maybe that can be worked past. I don't know. So leadership is certainly something to think about in this team. The point is this team certainly doesn't lack for firepower. You know, I think Kusta will wind up being a good op for this team. I think he is a bit more skilled of an op than Adren, so he should be able to add to that. You still have Nitro, who, when he's not leading and focused on fragging, he can definitely do that. Hiko seems to be back in form. I wanted to point that out really quick as well. He had one of his best events in a long time at the major qualifier, and I know that he spoke on his stream about wanting to focus on, death matching and practicing his aim and stuff because he didn't want to be washed up. He wanted to get back to his old form, and he looks like he's almost there, between the major qualifier and some of the recent online plays. He seems to be getting those numbers again. So, he's getting back in form as well as more of a passive rifle. Then Elige, he's kind of hit or miss, but he still has his games where he can have a huge impact. So I don't think and then Simple, despite the fact he looked pretty rough in that Hellraiser series and the decider at the qualifier, in general, he brings a lot of skill and should, in time contribute very well fragging also. So they have a lot of firepower. That's a big positive for this team, but the leadership thing is going to be a big question. Fitting Simple into the team is also going to be a big question because here's the thing. I think Simple's best role is going to be as kind of an aggressive rifler, but you already have that in Elige and in Nitro. So unless you shift maybe Elige to more of a passive role and maybe try him even out as an in-game leader, I guess, I don't know, and you have Nitro and Simple working together entry-wise, with Hiko being more of a passive rifle and Kusa with the op, maybe that can work. But when he was playing as a perimeter player, so more of a supportive guy, more of even an aggressive lurk guy, he really struggled in that HR series playing that role. So, you have to wonder about fitting him in the team role-wise. And then on top of that, it's just fitting him in with, his apparent personality conflicts he has with people. Apparently, Hiko's just had to kind of take him under his wing. That's why they're buddied up on CT side, all the time. They play sites together, like BM Mirage or... I'm trying to think, B on Dust 2. These are maps we're seeing them paired up together so Hiko can kind of keep his thumb on them, so to speak, and make sure he's directing them. And that can work on CT sides a lot, being partnered up. But on the T side of the map, you got to think about that a little bit more. So that is going to be a question. I do wonder this. I hope that Simple learned something from this major qualifier where he played really poorly against Hellraisers individually, but his team still wound up carrying him through it and winning him a series. He obviously got very emotional in his post-game interview, and I think that was genuine. I think he really did realize just how close he came to not getting there, and I think he realized that he didn't do well, and Hellraisers played even better, but he had people on his team step up and carry him through that. And I hope that this teaches him that, you got to respect your teammates. These guys are going to be your support system. And I think Hiko has been very supportive and has tried to take him under his wing, like I noted. So I hope he learned something there, and I hope that can help him maybe adjust better with some of these personality conflicts and supposed attitude problems. So yeah, fitting Simple in emotionally, role-wise, etc., that's something that is going to have to be addressed with this team as well. But like I said, I'm hoping that maybe he took a lesson from the major qualifier, and that will help the process. And I guess one other storyline out of this major qualifier was the fact that Adren had one of his better lands in quite a long time, but, probably it's too late now, right? He certainly won't be a part of the starting Liquid lineup except for the major, but he can still, like I said, contribute as a coach with this team, contribute with the coach at Cloud9. So as he can be a coach on an elite NA team, but if he wants to be a player, he's probably going to wind up being more of a mid-tier team. And he might have increased his resume to be on a better mid-tier team because of how he played this event with the op, but that's up to Adren what he wants to do, and I'll just leave it at that. So that's going to be the end of the video, just kind of doing an initial review of kind of the debut of some of these new top NA lineups over at CLG, Cloud9, and Liquid. Just talking a little bit about what they've done so far with their teams, what are some of the positive things that we've seen that they can build upon, and what are some of the concerns that needs to be addressed for them to, push things even further and become true international contenders. And again, once there's more data out there for teams like Energy, Complexity, and TSM, I'll certainly look to address that as well. And then, like I said, be on the lookout for an article about Splice, sometime soon after the publication of this vlog. So yeah, thanks a lot. If you enjoyed the content, please follow and subscribe for more. There's also plenty of other vlogs I have on this YouTube that relate to some of these roster changes and teams as well, if you want to, check those out. And yeah, thanks a lot for tuning in. See you next time.